Speaking of fascism, Leisha Miller made a video on Trump being a fascist. Let's take a look.
Floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Out of character for me to speak at a Nazi rally. I was just in Israel, but I took the gig.
As the first Samoan, Malaysian, low IQ, former California prosecutor ever to be elected president, it was just a groundswell of popular support.
One more week, y'all. We can do this. Yesterday, Trump held a rally at Madison Square Garden in New York, and honestly, I find reporting on rallies lately to be really boring because, like, yes, Trump said some batty things, and then Kamala called him a fascist. Great, that's frankly no longer particularly newsworthy. But last night's rally was a bit different, just in the level of racist, bigoted, hateful vitriol, which was turned up to 11. Frankly, Trump is feeling the heat because Kamala is out fundraising him, and she's pulling ahead of him in many polls, so he's leaning into what he does best, saying incendiary things in the hopes that his base will be angry enough to show up in droves on election day, and if there aren't enough for him to win, they'll be angry enough to believe the election stealing lies afterwards and maybe succeed in their coup this time. And this hateful xenophobic rhetoric, combined with his connections to Project 2025 and his calls for mass deportations and attacking the enemy from within.
I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick.
Continue.
All right. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Oops.
People, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military.
Has many people, including Kamala Harris, sounding alarm bells about fascism. Trump even speaks positively about Hitler and is looking for generals with the same level of loyalty as he had. And so while I think comparing politicians and movements to Hitler and Nazis is a bit overblown generally, and I avoid doing it because it should be reserved for when the comparison is actually particularly apt, I think we have reached a point where the comparison is particularly apt. So today we're breaking down the fascist things Trump has said during his campaign and comparing that to Hitler. We all study the Holocaust in school and learn a lot about the aftermath of World War II, but taking a look at the years leading up to the war, the things Hitler said and the way he took power is, let's just say, instructive.
Yeah, and it's also definitely underreported for some fucking weird reason. People just don't think about, like, they don't even think logically about how we arrived at Adolf Hitler, like how Adolf Hitler materialized. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen out of thin air. Like, it's so fucking stupid to look at Donald Trump, who has invoked Hitler on numerous occasions, and just be like, oh, he's not Hitler, shut up.
And all the more reason to show up and vote this year for Kamala Harris, whether you like it or not, frankly. Let's get into it. First, let's just define fascism. This word gets thrown around a lot, so it's worth giving it a technical definition. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, fascism is a political ideology and mass movement. Although fascist parties and movements differed significantly from one another, they had many characteristics in common, including extreme militaristic nationalism, contempt for electoral democracy and political and cultural liberalism, a belief in natural social hierarchy and the rule of elites, and the desire to create a people's community in which individual interests would be subordinated to the good of the nation. Fascist is seen as an insult and a dirty word today, and for good reason, but in its heyday it was proudly and openly embraced. Europe's first fascist leader was Benito Mussolini, whose National Fascist Party took power in 1922. Fascism spread throughout Europe in the years between the two world wars, largely as a backlash against the results of World War I. Virtually every European country had a fascist faction or party, and many countries saw those parties take power, including, of course, Italy and Germany. There were also fascist movements outside Europe, and I don't mean to be Eurocentric here, but this isn't a treatise on fascism, and I'm focusing on Hitler today, which requires talking mainly about Europe. Now, what makes a fascist? Unlike other political ideologies, fascism is unique because it doesn't have one clear theoretical framework, and instead it adapts to the specific cultural and historical conditions depending on where in the world it manifests. It is generally an amalgamation of a few key ideas. 1. Radical nationalism. In fascism, the ethnically and culturally homogenous core of the nation is the most valuable and central aspect of political life. We must do everything in our power to return to that historical homogeneity, whether real or imagined, as a means of protecting the nation from the threat of outsiders, both external and within our own borders. Number 2, populist authoritarianism. Fascism promotes the idolization and mythologization of charismatic central leaders who are seen as embodiments of the people's will and of the nation itself, which falls in line with fascism's belief in authoritarianism, wherein the leader is infallible and above the law. And number 3, anti-liberal and anti-democratic. Traditionally, fascism expresses its anti-liberal sentiments through a rejection of the liberal emphasis on individual rights and freedoms, and instead advocating for subordination of individualism in favor of the collective fight for the nation. Democratic processes are weak, bureaucratic, and inefficient. The will of the nation must be implemented through swift, decisive action by the idolized leader, who embodies the will of the nation anyway, so let him just do his thing. Unlike traditional conservatism, which advocates for order and tradition, fascism brings a revolutionary fervor and populist rhetoric that alienates traditional conservatives as well as liberals. It is more radical, more movement-driven, and, as I said, more willing to fudge traditional political ideology in order to achieve the ultimate end goals of radical nationalism and populist authoritarianism. And a lot of the details of any particular fascist ideology differs depending on the specific location and moment in time when it manifests. Those details generally revolve around scapegoating and fear-mongering.
Yeah, an American fascism, homegrown domestic fascism here takes a lot from the early proto-fascist stages, whether it be the Confederacy, white supremacist ideals that have been left unexamined in the United States of America and still play a formative role in the way that our society is designed. And beyond that, McDonald's burger, like a lot of McDonald's burger, capitalist consumerism.
Capitalizing on whatever is most scary to the population and giving them a group towards which to target their anger. In Italy and Germany, the fascist parties capitalized on the anger and fear of war veterans, the middle class, and other segments of society who felt alienated and threatened by societal and economic change. And socialists, who were violent, godless revolutionaries intent on dissolving the traditional way of life, like the Bolsheviks in Russia, as well as Jews, who were allegedly involved in, the massive plot to control banks in the world through an underground network, etc.
Yeah, also, just remember that, like, socialism, in the way that the Nazis examined it, was a second Jewish religion. That's the way they treated it, at least. Now, obviously, the real goal was to eviscerate any matter of socialization that was occurring. And a really good way to do that was by dehumanizing Jewish people and then, playing the role of, oh, Jews are responsible for this, or vice versa. Yeah, Judeo-Bolshevism,
etc. This trope has been around for a very long time. They were the chosen scapegoats, along with everyone else who didn't fit the mold of the imagined traditional cohesive identity of the nation. So in the case of Germany, that's...
Yeah, by the way, you might notice that Judeo-Bolshevism, i.e. Jewish Bolshevism, has turned into cultural Marxism in the United States of America. You can't just openly be anti-Semitic in the same way, especially because everybody understands well, that's a Nazi. And everybody understands that Nazis are bad. So we've repackaged the exact same sentiment. We just say that the responsible parties are directly the George Soros types. Some powerful Jews are doing unrestricted immigration from the third world in an effort to destabilize the first world, in an effort to destabilize the supreme Western civilization and all of its offerings.
That's the pseudoscientific Aryan race, a discredited concept that was invented in the 19th century by racist linguists, as well as a bastardization of social Darwin.
How can there exist both the rhetoric of Judeo-Bolshevism and Jews controlling the banks? Is this just rightoid brain rot? I don't know. How can Americans say that immigrants are stealing your jobs, but also are stealing your social safety nets because they're jobless, lazy immigrants?
And then adopted by extremists in the 20th century to validate their violent ideologies. And no one adopted it quite as hard as Adolf Hitler. Through the idealization of the Aryan race, Hitler was able to capitalize on fears of economic instability and communism in the wake of World War I, and then direct those fears towards those who didn't fit the mold. Got a problem? It was probably the Jews, or the communists, or the homosexuals who are predators, or the disabled who are useless eaters stealing your food.
Are you noticing a trend here, by the way? Because, it kind of feels like I can't tell if Leisha's talking about Adolf Hitler and the rise of fascism in Germany, or if she's talking about contemporary American Republican Party sentiment that gets thrown around.
in your resources that was an actual talking point in Nazi propaganda. By playing into those fears and othering the people who do not fit the nationalist mold, fascists are able to create a strong identity, an us versus them mentality, which further solidifies that group dynamic. From this emerges what appears to be a safe haven for loyal members, where they will be protected, where there are clear answers for how to solve their problems, and where they can fight for their righteous national identity behind a strong leader that is above the law. Okay, now that we have the basics out of the way, let's examine how fascism manifested itself in Germany ahead of World War II, and I think you'll find this history very instructive. World War I led to the collapse of the German Empire and the creation of a new democratic republic. The new German government was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which restricted Germany's ability to build an army or participate in any aggressive behavior, as well as requiring Germany to pay restitution and cede colonies and land. The reparations and restrictions after World War I tanked the German economy. In September 1923, $1 was worth 4 billion German marks. Soon after, the global economic collapse of 1929 led to deep unemployment, hunger, poverty, and homelessness in the early 1930s in Germany. This level of economic upheaval, combined with a sense that the world was unfairly attempting to suppress Germany and the German people, created a situation rife for backlash and movement building. Movements on both ends of the political spectrum were built, and many attempted to overthrow the new government. This also meant that the new government was deeply divided, making it nearly impossible to pass new laws, and many Germans lost faith in their leaders' ability to govern. Sound familiar? The Nazi Party was one of many new movements that grew out of this post-World War I discontent. And Adolf Hitler, a young wounded World War I veteran, joined early in 1919. The group was impressed with his organization and oratory skills, and he became responsible for recruitment and propaganda, organizing larger party meetings and rallies where he would give speeches that made him indispensable to the party and its growth. In 1920, he developed the party's 25-point program, including pushing for an overhaul of the party structure that replaced the Democratic Committee with a single leader with ultimate control. When this restructuring was rejected, Hitler resigned. After the heads of the party realized that Hitler's speaking and organizing skills meant that without him, the party would flounder, they agreed to his demands and made Hitler the party chairman. In 1923, Hitler led a failed coup attempt that involved a march on the War Ministry building that resulted in violence. 14 Nazis died and 4 policemen were killed. Hitler was later arrested and spent less than a year in prison, where he wrote Mein Kampf. After this failed coup, Hitler realized it would be more effective for him to take over Germany through electoral means by winning democratic support for his party and getting elected to power. So he got organized. He divided the country into regions, which each had a designated leader, then subsections of those regions, which each had a designated leader, and then even smaller sections inside those subsections, also with designated leaders, and each leader answered to the section leader above them, who ultimately answered to Hitler. Groups were also formed for doctors, lawyers, etc. to infiltrate existing social structures and help the party gain more members and supporters. Hitler also established a new leader for the SA, the paramilitary arm of the Nazi Party. Initially, this paramilitary was a militia made up of ex-World War I soldiers and unemployed men who were disorderly and had free reign over their activities. To give this militia an air of legitimacy, Hitler appointed a strict leader to give the SA a more defined role. The SS was a small subdivision of the SA, originally meant to act as Hitler's bodyguards. The SS was significantly expanded in 1929 when Hitler put Heinrich Himmler in charge, who would lead the SS to police the entire Third Reich. These SS members were chosen based on their racial purity, blind obedience, and fanatical loyalty to Hitler. The more loyal you could prove yourself, the higher up the ranks you'd go. Sound familiar? As the military arms of the Nazi Party grew, so too did the propaganda wing. Joseph Goebbels used simple, effective communication through modern media like films and radio, combined with traditional campaigning tools like posters and newspapers. The propaganda played into Germans' fears during uncertain and unstable times. These included instilling fear of unemployment in the working class, portrayals of ideals of family and the role of women as mothers, and scapegoating Jews and communists as a source of most of their economic and personal woes. Through this propaganda, Goebbels built an image of Hitler as the strong, stable leader Germany needed to become a great power again. Goebbels was so effective and loyal that he was appointed Minister of Propaganda in 1933. The economic unrest during the Great Depression led to numerous leadership turnovers at the head of the German government, and the success of Nazi propaganda in obtaining popular support for Hitler and the Nazi movement was evident in the growing success in the elections. In 1928, the Nazi Party won just 2.6% of the vote, getting just 12 seats in the German parliament. 2 years later, in 1930, they won 18%, and 2 years after that, in 1932, Hitler ran for president, losing, but with 36.8% of the vote. This turned Hitler...
Very important to understand, like, what the inception of this movement in such a short period of time, how much popularity they were able to cultivate. There's definitely not only a parallel here for Donald Trump, but also for the Reform Party, or AfD, in Germany, or the Nationalist Party in France. Very, very important to recognize. Okay? Now, that process might come across as accelerated in a place like the United States of America because we don't have a parliamentary structure. We don't have like a multi-party system. We have a duopoly. So Donald Trump, being a billionaire, was able to completely take over, overtake the one major party in our duopoly and rebuild it in his own image.
From leader of a radical paramilitary organization in the early 1920s to credible politician in the early 1930s. The 1932 parliamentary election gave Nazis 230 seats, with 37% of the vote, becoming the largest party in the German parliament, just 4 years after only winning 2.6%. Hitler, as leader of the largest party in parliament, was named Chancellor of Germany, sworn in on January 30th, 1933. As Hitler's chances of being elected president dwindled in 1932, remember he lost with 36% of the vote, a group of conservative elites, members of the ruling class and new industrialist business class met secretly to back Hitler as chancellor. Among the
This is very important to understand. Sound familiar? You got some tech CEOs getting together and going, hey, we got our guy in there, Peter Thiel's own blood boy, J.D. Vance. We're kind of on board with that, don't you think? Yeah, they were liberals, by the way. Not every single one of them was like ideologically committed.
Group were political leaders and the son of the current president, along with important wealthy industrialists. Their support was vital to Hitler eventually being named chancellor by Germany's president. The idea being that they needed a strong authoritarian power in place to protect their power and money, and they saw their opportunity in Hitler. Sound familiar? But at this point, the Nazis were just one party in a three-party coalition government alongside a non-Nazi president. In an attempt to consolidate more power, Hitler called for another election in 1933 and went on a propaganda blitz to try to win as many more parliamentary seats as possible. But then in February 1933, the German parliament building was suddenly set ablaze, burning to the ground and instilling panic in the public over the potential terror attack. A young Dutch communist was arrested for the crime, playing into the Nazi party's scapegoating of communists and amplifying their fear-mongering propaganda. 4,000 communists were subsequently imprisoned as a result. The day after the fire, the president of Germany signed the emergency decree for the protection of the German people. Through this presidential decree, Hitler got emergency powers. The decree suspended basic personal freedoms like the freedom of speech, the right to own property, and the right to trial before imprisonment. This gave Nazis a legal and legitimized basis to persecute and oppress opponents as traitors to the Republic, because people could be imprisoned for no reason. The Communist Party and its democratically elected parliament members were banned from parliament. The elections went forward as planned. In March, now under the fear of potential political persecution, many people feared for their safety in casting their ballots. The Nazi Party won 43% of the vote, an increase of nearly 10% over the election held just 6 months before. 2 weeks after the election, Hitler proposed a law to parliament that would give him the power to rule by decree, meaning he could just issue a decree and it would become law, as opposed to proposing laws to parliament for approval. The terror and fear that was still very palpable after the attack on parliament 1 month before, combined with the support of political elites, gave Hitler's otherwise bat-crazy proposal that air of legitimacy it needed. Hitler won over the...
That's what happens when you have wealthy people on your side. And you also, ironically, on the one hand, are calling the press the lying press, also known as fake news, while simultaneously there's an impact of normalization that's coming from those in positions of power that are saying, no, this guy's not that bad. Come on now. Like, let's say there is like a billionaire owner of a newspaper or something. Now, I don't want to talk too much shit because he's my boss too, but just something to consider. Maybe there's a billionaire owner of a social media platform, for example, who's in the tank for this kind of Hitlerian figure. No, I'm not talking about Ford, even though Elon Musk is American Henry Ford.
Party by promising to protect the interests of the Catholic Church, and with the communist parliament members banned from attending and the newly and illegitimately elected Nazi members of parliament, Hitler was able to get the parliament to pass his enabling law 444 to 94. Again, lending an air of legitimacy to what was an absolutely anti-democratic power grab. That same month, March 1933, the Nazis opened Dachau, their first concentration camp, to house and murder their political opponents. In the years that followed, Hitler continued his work to appear moderate while slowly taking over through nominally democratic means, lending to the illusion of stability and democracy. Tension between the SA, remember that paramilitary group, and Nazi leadership grew as the SA wanted to engage in more overt revolutionary activities, and Hitler had Himmler and others in his ear, making him fearful of a potential SA coup. This led to the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934, in which most of the SA leadership, as well as other political opponents, were arrested and murdered without trial. Goebbels, the propaganda leader of the party, created media coverage that presented the attack as a preventative measure in response to a planned coup on the government. Since the SA were seen by the public as being unruly and violent, many saw the attack as a legitimate move by the government to ensure public order. And in July, the parliament retrospectively passed a bill legalizing the purge as an emergency defense measure. Again, more legal legitimacy. Outside of the military, from 1933 to 1934, the Nazi Party systematically took control of all aspects of Germany, all through what were considered legal and democratic means because of Hitler's decree powers given to him democratically by parliament. He issued the Act for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service, removing anyone of non-Aryan descent from civil service, including the removal of any judges that were deemed non-compliant with Nazi law or principles. The Nazis replaced the Supreme Court with the People's Court, on which sat judges chosen specifically for their Nazi beliefs. Goebbels was put in charge of controlling the national media, arts, and culture, ensuring they all advocated for Nazi ideas. Then, in August 1934, the president of Germany, the final check on Hitler's power, died. Shortly after, Hitler announced that the offices of the chancellor and the president would be combined to create one consolidated leader, and that Hitler himself would occupy the role. To once again lend an air of democratic legitimacy to this proclamation, a vote was held for German people to decide whether or not they approved of the merging of the offices and Hitler's new role as Führer. According to official reports, 95% of the population voted and 90% voted in favor of Hitler. A reminder that there was a lot of political persecution and threats happening at this time. By the end of 1934, the Nazis managed to take over every major aspect of German government and place Hitler at the top with zero checks to his power, all using ostensibly democratic means. From there, Germany exhibited increasingly antagonistic behavior internationally, leading to the annexation in 1938 of Austria and of the northern part of Czechoslovakia that the Germans lost after World War I, and finally the invasion of Poland in 1939, which started World War II. There's obviously so much more to this story, but this brief history highlights especially the means that Hitler used to gain power within Germany, with the air of legitimacy so strong that to this day, some people still say that the people elected Hitler, which, as we've learned, isn't entirely true. And so all of this begs the question, is Trump a fascist? Well, I hope based on all of the information I've just shared, it's a pretty clear and resounding yes from you, but let me just connect the dots so it's extra abundantly clear. Let's take the core aspects of fascism in turn. 1. Radical nationalism. Check. Trump's Make America Great Again slogan imagines a made-up past as a vision for a utopian future. And central to that is a shared American identity. What that identity is depends on which group you're asking, but generally that's going to be white, Christian, heterosexual family units. This is made clear by the work Trump and his followers do to attack anyone who doesn't follow that mold. Immigrants, Muslims, trans folks, Black single mothers, anyone who doesn't fit the mold is open for ridicule, with the end goal being a return to this imagined shared identity. Number 2, populist authoritarianism. Check. When asked, Trump's followers, at least the ones who make it in the clips from rallies, indicate a willingness to completely ignore his words and actions, to completely accept his felony record because he is infallible, he is above the law, he is godlike, and he is not to be questioned. They don't care.
There's a classic cartoon that shows other convicted felons. There's Gandhi, there's Nelson Mandela, and then there's Trump.
Despite his nonsensical ramblings and inability to talk in full sentences, Trump has a charm to him that allows him to win people over and make them feel like he's one of them, despite embodying zero of the same qualities of most of his followers. Project 2025 and Trump himself would have him at the helm of a government stripped of checks and balances, stripped of regulations and government agencies, and stripped of any civil servant who hasn't professed a loyalty to Trump himself. Number 3, anti-liberal. Check. Trump's flavor of anti-liberalism is an example of how fascism is able to adapt depending on where and when it's manifesting. This is America. An outward declaration that people should give up individual freedoms for the good of the collective is a hard sell in the most individualistic country in the world. So anti-liberalism instead manifests itself a bit more discreetly. Yes, we care about freedom of speech, but only the speech of the right people. Yes, we care about freedom of the press, but we sow doubt in the mainstream media and any media that isn't loyal to Trump wherever possible. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he's literally said he's going to revoke the broadcast licenses of corporations, media companies that he does not like. And he said that he's going to jail people for burning the American flag.
Yes, we believe in freedom of religion, but only for Christians. Individual freedoms in Trump's fascism all come with a caveat that render them applicable.
Are people stupid saying liberals will be with him? First of all, liberals were with Hitler. She mentioned that as well. When she says liberalism in this circumstance, she's actually talking about the political theory of liberalism, which is, I mean, she even invokes like American individualism as an aspect of liberalism, which is correct. She's not wrong that fascism is inherently anti-liberty, as in no social liberalism, no social progress, no allowance for people to live however they see fit. It is a massive aspect. What do you think we're talking about when we talk about abortion bans? Abortion bans are directly a way to target the freedom that women have to make their own choices. It's a way to rip away bodily autonomy from women. Same with anti-gay, anti-trans policies, which, by the way, the Nazis were super on board with as well, for the record, just if you don't know. Like, if you were to not describe the Nazi movement in its conquest and its rise to power, and just not name them Nazis and explain to the average Republican the things that they did without openly mentioning that they were Nazis that did it, the average Republican would be on board with it. It's bar for bar what the Republican Party is trying to do. Yeah, the first book burning ever was trans medical documentation.
Only to the group of people who fit into the aforementioned made-up traditional identity of the nation. And number 4, anti-democratic, also check. You hear it in the dog whistles that have been adopted by his followers. We're not a democracy, we're a republic. You see it in Project 2025 and in Trump's own professed plans. Fire civil servants who aren't loyal, replace judges with loyalists, get rid of the administrative state in favor of a concentration of power in the hands of the president who can act swiftly and decisively without the inconvenience of regulations, unchecked by other branches or by the will of the people. And when Trump says he wants generals as loyal to him as Hitler had, that is coming from a place of having studied how Hitler did what he did. Studied may be too strong of a word, as I'm not convinced Trump can read words really good, but he surrounds himself with people who can. Like Hitler, Trump has capitalized on the fears of his base: astronomical economic inequality, racial animosity, changing societal norms. Like Hitler, Trump has chosen a handful of scapegoats that can be blamed for everything without needing any actual evidence to back it up. Can't find housing? Immigrants took it. Can't find a job? Immigrants took it. Feeling unsafe? Probably the immigrants, or the blacks, or the black immigrants.
They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
Like Hitler, Trump and his cronies have infiltrated every aspect of public life in order to take control or discredit it. Trump alone didn't do this, but his supporters have been working for decades to lay the groundwork. For example, the Kochs and their network have funded academic institutions to push questionable free market ideology. They have funded think tanks to push articles and policy around those ideologies, including the Heritage Foundation, creator of Project 2025. They have funded lobbyists to then bring those policies to the politicians, and they have funded the re-election campaigns of those same politicians. Trump and his cronies have pushed propaganda to discredit academics and experts as brainwashed liberals, as communists. They've pushed propaganda to discredit reputable news media as filled with those same brainwashed liberals and communists. Trump has led his followers to believe that their way of life, their beliefs, their livelihood, and their safety is being persecuted by a dangerous, growing tide of leftists and communists who would have their children.
Fake victimhood is such a solid way to get cushy, comfy, cozy pieces of shit on board with your ideology. Christians love talking about their fear of persecution, that like Christians in America are persecuted at every turn. How are they being persecuted in a fucking Christian nation? Oh, that's right, because gay people exist, because trans people exist, because abortions are happening all around them. And it's so wild. Like, the fake victimhood is so deeply baked into the American conservative movement.
children turn trans and pee in litter boxes, give their jobs to immigrants, get rid of all measures of public safety, and suppress their First and Second Amendment rights. Conveniently, danger is closing in from all sides, and the perpetrators are the very people who don't fall in line for Trump. And all of this is cloaked under a false sense of legitimacy because he was elected fair and square once. Fair and square, however, is arguable because he lost the popular vote and voter suppression is very real, but technically he won. And now that he's held power legitimately once, he's willing to use whatever tools necessary while attempting to appear moderate and to be operating within the confines of the law, just like Hitler did, to maintain and consolidate that power. And through populism, propaganda, and fear-mongering, he's managed to convince his followers that it's in their best interest to elect him when it's not. All the while, he's backed by today's version of wealthy industrialists who believe that with him in the White House, their money and power will go untouched and unchallenged. And on the similarities go. Trump is a fascist. If he wins next week, there will be far fewer checks on his power than there were the first time, thanks to the damage he did during his first administration. It is only through a decisive victory that we can hopefully definitively shut down Trump's power, as well as his challenges to the election results after the fact. But hope is not lost. You do not need a time machine to go back and kill Hitler. You can do your part now to vote against fascism in our own era. Go to iwillvote.com to check your registration and set up a voting plan. If you haven't voted already, do you have a plan to vote? Comment it below. It helps to actually write it down. I will be voting on election day because I love being in the action on the day of. So I will walk to my polling place after breakfast on November 5th, and I will cast my vote for Kamala Harris. Is she advocating for the progressive policies I want? Hell no. But she's not fucking Hitler, so she's got my vote. If you want ad-free and uncensored versions of these videos, join me over on Patreon.
Not to be negative, but we're kind of doomed. I mean,